Hello and welcome everyone. Joining me today is the Director of Development at the Women's Support Center, Jilozian. Ani is a women's rights advocate who leads programs and research on gender-based violence in Armenia. But today we're going to have a conversation about how Azerbaijan's blockade, 7th-month blockade of Artsakh, is affecting its women's population. Ani-Jan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So we know that everyone has been suffering from the blockade, right? From elderly to children, the ill. There's no food, there's no fuel, there's no transportation, there's no medicine. And each segment, I guess, is being affected differently, and they all have their own challenges that they're facing. But I guess right now what I would like to focus on is how is this really affecting, what challenges are women in the region facing?
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this issue. It's something that is really difficult, and it's something that we've been facing now, as you mentioned, for 7 months. Just to provide more context, let me say that this has been going on since December of last year. It's 120,000 residents of Artsakh are under siege. And as you mentioned, there's the issues of transportation. There's rampant violations to the right to life. We see threats and shootings in the direction of civilian residences. And we see rampant violations also to the right to health, with little to no medication available, no access to health care. We received a report recently that there have been a tripling in the number of miscarriages among women. I feel like my words are stuck in my throat because it's really so hard to talk about this issue. We know that women and other vulnerable populations are disproportionately affected in the aftermath of war and during conflict, and Artsakh is no exception to this. I could rattle off figures and facts about how women are disproportionately affected, but I feel like it's so hard now to talk about this with any sort of neutral language. When you have an elderly person who hasn't been able to see their primary care physician for months, can't take their medication and dies of a heart attack, that's a death that could have been prevented had this illegal blockade been lifted. When you have a woman with 2 young children who has to go out in search of food and makes a decision to leave her home only to come back and find that her children have died of heat exhaustion, those are preventable deaths that could have been prevented had this illegal blockade been lifted. In the aftermath of the war, we saw also that the majority of displaced people coming to Armenia were women, children, and the elderly. There are populations of people here in Armenia continuing to suffer, trying to find a way to make a living. I could go on, but I think we can probably move on to the next question.
As you mentioned, and I think it's widely known that conflict disproportionately affects women and girls, but oftentimes they're not very involved in the actual negotiation processes. How would you describe the participation of women and girls in Artsakh in the current negotiation processes during these times? And then maybe afterwards talk a little bit about how the women in Armenia are getting involved.
At the highest levels of decision-making, women and girls in Artsakh and in Armenia have been completely left out of the negotiation process. And this speaks to the larger issue of limited women's political participation in Armenia. During this conflict and during the last 3 decades and more, we actually have some of the lowest rates of political participation of women in the region. And it's important to address this issue because we know that women and others from vulnerable populations, they have a diversity of perspectives to offer this administration and in overcoming multiple crises, whether that's war and conflict or climate change or other crises that unfold. Without that diversity of perspectives, it's too difficult to move through these issues. And we can't have long-lasting democracy without the voice and of women and other vulnerable groups.
Yeah, representation of their, yeah. And then there are several NGOs, both internationally and locally, that deal with supporting women and women's rights. What, if any, has the response been regarding the blockade?
Our organization, the Women's Support Center, has been very vocal about this issue. We've co-signed letters and statements to high-level officials. Since the first day of the war, we've been mobilizing to provide women and their families with essential goods, household items, hygiene kits, food, and other necessary things. Women's support services, generally speaking, have a vital role to play when it comes to conflict and the aftermath of war. Our organization and the other domestic violence support centers in all of the regions have supported over 7,000 families since the start of the war.
Displaced families.
Displaced and conflict-affected families. And in addition to essential goods, we've been involved. Our center, for instance, was a distribution point during the war. And we mobilized, we got together the goods, and we distributed it to the most needy families. We were also involved in decisions. For instance, when it came to hygiene kits and when it came to goods that were being delivered to families, it was our interventions that ensured that menstrual hygiene was taken into consideration, that when it came to food rations, it wasn't just dry food that was being delivered to families. So this is the role that Women's Specialist Services can and should play. Our support services in the regions have also played a tremendous role in supporting families who have come displaced and conflict-affected families, providing counseling. We've also provided them with legal aid, with shelter, with monetary resources. We've provided them also with a means to start their own small businesses, to reintegrate into society. So women's support services play a vital role in this respect, and typically they're undervalued.
And this is something that's been going on even recently. So it's not just during the period of war, it's been going on for the past few years since then, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm talking with our representatives in Goris, in Godaik. They're constantly in touch with women and their families in Artsakh or otherwise, or in Armenia, displaced from Artsakh. And, you know, we are kind of that direct link with those families. We understand their needs, we understand their perspectives, and we do our best to make sure that their opinions and their perspectives are reflected in these larger decision-making processes.
Yeah, in light of the challenging circumstances that Artsakh is now facing due to the blockade, what are ways that some international communities can support or assist the vulnerable groups, particularly women? Are there any specific initiatives or actions that individuals or organizations can take to make a positive impact?
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that the international response has been lackluster, and that's putting it lightly. We've called on the UN Secretary General to put forth an urgent fact-finding mission. We co-signed this statement with other civil society organizations. It's really imperative that we get in there, that we urge the UN and other international bodies to lift this blockade because they have the power to do so. There are pressure, the International Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, all of these organizations have called out this blockade for what it is. It's illegal. The international community has a commitment to lift this blockade, and they have the power to do so.
And as an individual, what could, let's say, I do to show my support, for example?
I think the best way individuals can show their support, in addition to urging the UN and other international bodies to take this situation seriously, is to really do their due diligence in finding vetted organizations on the ground doing this work who are providing support to vulnerable families, and just reach out to them. We can best assist you in telling you what gaps there are, how you can help, whether that's through donations or volunteering or other ways of assisting. Get in touch with the organizations on the ground doing the work, and there are many ways that people can get involved in this effort.
And would you be able to maybe list a couple aside from, let's say, there's the Women's Support Center?
There's our support center and the regional domestic violence support centers doing this work. There's a lot of initiatives out there. It's hard to mention just a few. I said Artsakh is one. And there's so many local grassroots organizations doing this work. So again, I urge all of the listeners today to really reach out to our organizations and see what you can do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us and talking to us about this topic. And yes, for those of you who are watching at home, try and do some research and see what these grassroots organizations are and how you can show your support as well. And as always, thank you for joining CivilNet.